All right, welcome everybody again. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're based. This is Yamila Simonovsky. I'm the coordinator for the Youth Employment Funders Group. We want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We will learn and discuss more about these opportunities to boost productivity as well as job creation for young people in Africa through enterprise development. So we are very excited to be holding this webinar co-organized by Include and the Youth Employment Funders Group. So before we dive into today's presentations, we wanted to just give you a few words on the Youth Employment Funders Group and on Include, in case you are not familiar with them before today. So the Youth Employment Funders Group is a network of international donors, including multilateral organizations, private foundations, bilateral organizations, working together to generate and share more and better evidence-based knowledge on what works in the field of youth employment. The aim is to ultimately address the youth employment challenge in a more coordinated and effective manner. And we're going to be discussing more about that later on based on the findings on the paper and some of the recommendations. And the group has been meeting since 2009, working on various topics, both in person and virtually through these type of activities like webinars. Include, it's an independent knowledge platform initiated by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2012. And the main objective of Include is to share knowledge and insights on inclusive development in Africa with Dutch and African policymakers and practitioners. So you can see how this webinar fits very well within these two groups, and it was a great opportunity to have this joint webinar. And as part of both networks' mission to share knowledge and new evidence, we are very pleased to have Evert-Jan Kwak from IDS present the findings of a synthesis report that just was launched a couple of months ago on private sector development interventions and better quality job creation for youth in Africa, that he co-authored with Justin Flynn, who I can see is already joining us. And then Theodore Clovis will give us his reflections and started the discussion. He's the program manager for Orange Corners Africa and Middle East and policy officer for youth employment from the Netherlands Enterprise and Development Agency. So this report that we're going to be discussing today forms part of the Boosting Decent Employment for Africa's Youth Initiative. And Agnieszka from Include will give you now a bit more information about that. And then we'll move forward with the presentation by Evert-Jan and the discussion as well as a Q&A session at the end. So just regarding the Q&A, you are more than welcome to share your reflections as we are giving the presentations. You can put them, there's a little symbol on the left bottom that says conversation. So you can type your questions there and we can read them later on, or you can also ask them directly at the end of the webinar. Of course, we want to hear your questions and we want to hear your reflections on how these findings resonate with your daily practice in each of your organizations. So again, feel free to write them down in the chat during the presentations or ask them directly during the Q&A. So I'll leave it there and pass it to Agnieszka so that she can give us a bit more details on the initiative.
Yeah, thank you, Jamila. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Also on behalf of Include, my name is Agnieszka Kazimierczuk. I'm a knowledge manager for Include. Thank you, first of all, very much for joining. I'm very happy to say a few words about the Boosting Decent Employment for Africa's Youth initiative. This program is a 3-year partnership between Canada's International Development Research Centre, IDRC, Include, and the International Labour Organization, all under the guidance of the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth. This initiative has 3 main aims. Firstly, generate new rigorous evidence on how soft skills development and work-based learning may boost economic opportunities for youth. Secondly, develop a community of practice and engage youth to foster learning and policy outreach through multi-stakeholder dialogues within and between the countries or events like today. And thirdly, our ambition is to each year synthesize and share evidence on 4 or 5 most pertinent topics related to youth employment challenge in Africa. The first call for evidence synthesis papers that we launched last year focus on topic related to work-based learning schemes, employment creation for peace building, gender barriers and constraints on the labor market, and sustainable job creation. So today we are very pleased to partner with the Youth Employment Funders Group to present to you our first evidence synthesis papers in this series entitled Private Sector Development Interventions and Better Quality Job Creation for Youth in Africa, by Evertian Kwak and Justin Flynn from IDS, as Jamila mentioned. I think without any further ado, I will now give the floor to Evertian to present his and Justin's insight to it, and later to Theodore to react to his presentation before we open the floor for questions and discussions. So, Evertian, I pass it on to you.
So yes, thank you, Agnieszka. Reloading now the presentation. So yeah, my name is Evertian Kwak. I work for IDS, the Institute of Development Studies in Brighton in the UK, for the research cluster named Business Markets and the States. I worked on this. I will do this presentation, but as said, Justin Flynn was as well involved in doing this paper. And as the title says, and it has been mentioned already several times, the title is Private Sector Development Interventions and Better Quality Job Creation for Youth in Africa. So I think it is important to mention before we start that this is a synthesis paper, so it is unfortunately not our own data that I'm going to present, but it's a synthesis of already existing research. And we had access to quite a large amount of research. And I'm going to present very briefly the findings in this presentation. So the structure of this presentation is first to say something about employment data in sub-Saharan Africa or in Africa, then going to the research question and methodology. I will explain something about why the focus on private sector development interventions is important. Then we go to the findings and finally conclusions and recommendations. So first, I want to show you this. It's I recognize that it is a bit difficult to read, maybe, but the most important what I want to show with this figure is the unemployment, the youth unemployment rate in North Africa. I will point it. So that is this line, the red one, that is very high, and for sub-Saharan Africa is this green one over here. So the difference on official youth unemployment rates between North Africa as a region and sub-Saharan Africa is quite large. This came from this source. And it's also very important to understand that the average youth unemployment rate is 3 times higher globally than adult unemployment rates. So some other data on youth unemployment in Africa it's important to understand that there are many million young people, estimated at 10 to 12 million young people that enter each year the labor market, but there are only 3.1 million new jobs created. So that's a big problem in the African context. So where they rely on for their jobs is that they have to work in the informal sector. 85% of the labor force is estimated to be in the informal sector in sub-Saharan Africa. So that means that the youth employment crisis in sub-Saharan Africa looks a bit different from North Africa, as we already saw in the first figure, where you can say that in sub-Saharan Africa it is more an underemployment issue and less one of unemployment. So this figure is about formal and informal jobs. Employment, and I show you this one is for Africa, and the other ones are from other continents, the Middle East, and this but I want to focus just on this. This is Africa, and what you can see very quickly is the high amount of informality in the labor market in the continent. And this is for the young generation till 15 years to 24, and this is still for 29. So you can see that youth unemployment is mainly in the informal sector. So looking at that context that we have, our question for this paper was how can donors and governments through private sector development interventions provide greater employment opportunities in quality and quantity for Africa's young population. And we defined very broadly the young population of the youth in Africa, the group of 15 to 35 years old, and that's the definition as we followed for as used by the African Union. So very briefly, our methodology was based on our own ideas, literature and research as a base, because we do quite some work on youth employment and on private sector development. For our research then, we used academic databases, but our methodology was snowballing. We really looked at going through one reference to the other and creating a larger and larger list and amount of references. And our inclusion criteria was we try to look only on Africa, but we found that it's not always possible. So there is quite an amount of research that looks at Africa, but also to use data from other continents. So where this data has some good examples from Africa, we use that one, although the whole research was maybe included with more continents. So, but our focus was mainly on Africa, and we targeted at enterprise development and value chain development. And what I said, the youth between 15 and 35 years old. So why is the private sector development interventions, why is the focus on that? First of all, the private sector creates most jobs in the world, 9 out of 10 jobs. This is also the case for Africa, so that's with our focus on Africa important that it is also the private sector that provides 90% of the total employment opportunities there, although the majority is in low productivity and in informal sector. The labor market, if you look to the labor market studies, they all recognize that the Africa youth employment problem is more from the demand side of the labor market. So that means that there is a lack of demand for labor. So that means that the idea of the demand side of private sector development interventions could create more jobs by addressing specific constraints or market failures to improve entry and growth for firms. But there's also another point that the private sector development is interesting to look at. It's about productivity. 85% of the workers in sub-Saharan Africa are involved in low productivity sectors, and the low productivity sector is one of the main constraints for further economic development in the continent. And one of the important points that we also found is because we didn't look only to the amount of of jobs created, but also to the quality of jobs. And then the productivity is very important because, as you can, to quote here Benno, the increasing productivity is at the center stage for any strategy to increase the quality of employment. So, what kind of private sector development interventions are we talking about? So we have three levels that we distinguish. So there's the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. So the first level, the macro level, is really direct enterprise support. You can see here it's business advisory, mentoring, trainings, or finance. Because of the amount of evidence for different kinds of interventions on the micro level, we distinguished financial and non-financial interventions in our report. The meso level is support for specific sectors and value chains, and the macro level interventions are really looking at the broader enabling environment and investment climate. Our focus on this and most of the literature is on the micro level and on the meso level. So I'm going now to our findings. So if we look at the micro level and on the financial interventions, the literature is quite clear about some points, and one is that there seems to be a positive effect on job creation with finance interventions, but they typically create more jobs for the larger firms. The micro and the small firms see better firm performances because of the access to finance. But the creation of jobs is less. There is maybe an exception for that, and that's that high potential firms are often selected through thorough selection mechanism can create indeed jobs, although they are maybe small in size. And the sum is also important. Higher sums of funding to small enterprises are more likely to create jobs than the small amounts. And that relates that microfinance and inclusive finance programs show often, as the literature shows, no significant effects on employment. However, they mainly aim also for income stability, and they don't really aim for job creation. On the employment outcomes, there is some evidence that microfinance or inclusive finance programs they improve the self-employment for the person involved, and that's important for the underemployment effect, as was said before. There was also one reference that said that collective loans are likely to have stronger effects on employment than individual ones. And if you look to what kind of enterprises have access to these financial interventions, it looks like that there is a kind of missing middle in Africa. So there is quite some attention in interventions to look to the smaller firms and to the larger firms, but if they grow out of to being small, then there is not a lot of financial tools to support the middle segment. If we look at the micro level to more the capacity building and the training interventions and what they do, what their impact is on employment, it's again, it tends to be more effective for larger firms. Micro enterprises often lack resources to hire additional employees. They create higher incomes, but the employment effect is often very minimal. And there is evidence that training hastens the entry of firms that would enter anyway and have barely any impact on the business survival. It seems like that intensive short trainings or substantially extended training programs have the best business outcomes with positive spillovers on employment on the longer term. And then for the same is more or less for management and supervisory training programs. They seem to have a positive effect on employee and manager work relations and worker productivity, which in the long term can result in job creation and at better quality of jobs. It also seems that trainings and capacity building are more effective in if they are paired with other kind of business services like mentoring, support to product design, and especially for financial support. You really see that there is an increase in the employment impact when there is a financial and a non-financial intervention combined in one program or in. If you look at the meso level, so on the value chain and the sector interventions, we can see that they are most effective when they are targeting labor-intensive sectors in Africa, like agriculture or agro-processing, like manufacturing, due to the potential for increases in labor productivity. However, you have to be the job quality often remains low in these labor-intensive sectors. These interventions seem more effective when combined with enterprise development programs, so the ones I talked before on the micro level, and especially when they have access to finance for smaller firms, with the potential to link forward and backwards with lead firms and the value chain. And then interventions that create or support special economic zones or export production zones, they indeed show that they create new jobs, and in particular the low-skill intensive sectors seem to employ new entrants, while the industry that is more focusing on high-skill intensive labor are more likely to reallocate existing workers, so they don't really create new jobs. And also what the literature shows is that if you work effectively with local organization, producer organization, if you involve them, the effects are also great. There also have to be, the literature shows that these interventions have the potential for an inclusion, but also an exclusion. So it is be very specific. You have to be careful to see what these impacts are on specific groups. They attract, for example, in particular migrants from rural area or women workers, if you look at the low skill intensive sectors. But if the process happens that there is a process of upgrading, then you mainly see that the men enter the labor market and not the women, or they're pushing out the women even. So if we go to the macro level, what can we say about what the literature shows? What is the impact on youth employment? So first of all, attracting foreign direct investments. It does not necessarily have positive spillover effects on the labor market. There is in the literature a lot of discussion about this, but it seems that the low-income countries need a kind of absorption level that requires them to more benefit from those investments. It also seems that large infrastructure projects focus mainly on the demand from larger firms, and the evaluation focus on the short-term employment benefits, mainly from the construction phase, and they ignore those evaluations, mainly the crucial employment impact on specific sectors in the area, which is very important for the long-term development and the impact of those infrastructure projects for the whole area. And when regulations and procedures are simplified and become more transparent, you can see that more wage jobs are indeed created. And if you look to the wage subsidies for youth workers, they seem only to be effective once they are applied, but are not substantial after when they are removed. So for the long term, it needs to be focused on the longer term to be more beneficial for the youth. So what we see is that size matters. Investment in larger firms tend to have higher impacts in terms of numbers and quality of employment. Small firms may represent more potential, and there is a vast amount of small firms in Africa. But the problem is that they often fail to scale up and have low survival rates. So in the end, for sustainable employment creation, it seems that small firms are failing in the sense of creating that kind of employment. And the current interventions targeting micro and small firms are often very short-term and focusing mainly on trainings and microfinance services. They are often separated from each other. And they leave out most of the more expensive tailor-made interventions, who are most of the time targeting to the larger firms. And for that reason, it's also that maybe there is a discussion in the literature why the small firms and the larger firms, why is there a difference in the impact? It can be because of the failing rate, but it can also be because of the interventions targeting them. There's also a sector dilemma, or there's a trade-off. So labor-intensive sectors tend to create the highest number of jobs, as already said, but there is a trade-off because if you look for higher quality jobs, you want to achieve that in your programs, then you might have to look to more capital-intensive sectors. And interventions in the meso and macro level tend to focus more on the export markets and often ignoring shorter domestic or regional value chains. And those export markets indeed show that you can create jobs for the youth. However, also those jobs seem to be quite volatile due to the international competition and changes in demand. So sometimes you see programs in the coffee sector that creates quite an amount of jobs, but 10 years later, the effect is less. Then on formalization, we didn't do a very detailed research on formalization, but what we have seen in the literature about formalization and the quality of jobs is that enforcement of laws and employment registration tends to be the type of intervention that really ensure higher levels of formality. That the formalization only happens when there is a positive trade-off between the costs and the benefits. So if the benefits are higher than the cost, then of course firms are tending to go in and to move into the formal sector. So the question is how are you stimulating that? But on the impact outcomes, on the employment outcomes, it seems that formalization doesn't seem to be as big. So it depends more on the potential for upgrading and upscaling for those enterprises, and the formalization itself is not a job creator. Also, new technology can push youth into formal sector. You can see in the platform economy, but this often relates to low quality and insecure jobs. So an example can be in Indonesia, for example, in Indonesia, young people drive on the motors. They use the app like we do with the Uber to pick up their clients, but those jobs are really, really low quality and insecure jobs in the end. Although with that app, they work in the formal sector officially. So now we go to the conclusions. I will go quickly through it. So we separated conclusions of how to create, to increase the jobs for youth, and how to increase the quality of jobs for youth. So if we look at, if your focus is, and your aim is to create more jobs, then the focus and your investment should, as the literature shows, should be focusing more on the labor-intensive light manufacturing and food processing agriculture sector. Combine financial and non-financial enterprise development interventions with sector-specific innovation, regulation, infrastructural investments has also the best outcome. Building connections between lead firms and small medium enterprises to secure growth via forward and backward linkages is also very beneficial. And to integrate private sector development interventions with a broader and consistent long-term private sector development strategy that explicitly aims to create jobs for youth is important. That's important to have a larger strategy for job creation and for private sector development that looks and aims for the youth, which often is not the case now in African countries. Do not exclude low productivity firms. in the informal sector from private sector development interventions, but do not push too hard towards formalization, as they could backfire on firm performance and job creation. That's what I said before on the formalization, that it is a trade-off, and it is not a big gainer of jobs. And then you have sectors that use less youth. Special labor market policies such as wage subsidies can be considered, but only with a long-term focus and integrated with other interventions like training programs. So if you look to how do you create better quality jobs with your private sector development interventions, then productivity is a factor that must be included. So focus on firms that have the best potential to increase productivity and have the best outcome on creating job quality. However, ignoring lower potential firms will mean a sacrifice on much needed additional jobs in the short term. So that is do you really focus on quality, or do you focus on amount of jobs? It seems that certification schemes and private standards are a viable tool to increase the quality of jobs in specific sectors. And government must use and implement labor market policy and regulations to improve fair wages, worker protection, and working conditions. Without access to finance, firms will not invest in higher productivity. So the most efficient way is to give SMEs access to a larger amount of capital for productive investments to improve the quality of jobs over time. And training and capacity building and microfinance, they could support individual entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs to benefit them, especially for their labor and income. But it is not so for their quality of job, but they don't create necessarily more jobs in general. So if you look to the conclusions for partners and donors, so local investment opportunities by focusing on shorter local and regional value chains opportunities is a good option. And there is a point in our whole paper. You can see in several parts that for the African context that the political economy is very important. So there is always lots of literature looks from an purely economic perspective, but if you look to some other research, it really is in question of political economy in many cases. So, for example, you could see that very, very well in the decisions on where export production zones are created. That's very political and sensitive, but for the impact on employment, it's very important where those zones are created. And it's also with the missing middle segment in private sector in many African countries that it's a matter of political economy more than purely economic constraints. It's one of the conclusions from the literature is also that you should use a gender lens because there are significant disadvantages still faced by women that often force them to work in jobs that pay less and are more vulnerable or informal. And it seems that young women entrepreneurs still face more constraints than the young men in the same position. For example, with access to finance, it's very common in the literature that they state that women entrepreneurs face many more constraints. In regions, another conclusion can be that in regions with high dependence on extractive industry, interventions should not ignore the potential of extractive industries on local job creation. However, extractive industries must play their part to create more and better jobs in Africa. So there are regions in Africa that really with lots of extractive industries, and it is the aim should be to work with them and create local jobs, connecting the extractive industry, linking them with SMEs in that area. And there are some good examples that it is possible, although the extractive industry in general doesn't create very much direct jobs. But in this way, it is possible for those areas to create more jobs in the local economy. And a very important conclusion is that everything is very country specific, and every sector is different. So in strategies, in programs, in interventions, it's always very important to have that in mind. So in the end, the key recommendations are private sector development interventions should internalize youth employment issues and aggregate data collection to secure youth employment outcomes. Because the data and all the literature shows that data is there and it is improving, but still very, very much improvement is needed to have really good and better insights in the impact. Lots of the private sector development interventions, as mentioned in my presentation and in the paper, if you look to the evaluations, lots of them are not really focusing on youth, or they don't have any aggregate data on employment creation. So that's a good start to implement that already at the start, to give more insights for future improvements for those private sector development interventions. And the same is that private sector development interventions should sensitize engagement with specific youth groups, targeting diagnostics on this group to understand specific and localized constraints. It's in many cases, youth are mentioned as an objective, but they are not really participating in any of the programs. Long-term comprehensive private sector development approaches focuses on a specific value chain or a sector that includes seeking linkages between larger formal and smaller firms. They have the best youth employment outcomes. That is what already was said in the conclusions, but I wanted to highlight it here. It is really the comprehensive programs that seem to create the best jobs, especially on the on the sectoral value chain meso level, and seeking those linkages between small and larger firms. A partnership approach in private sector development interventions with local stakeholders in private sector, public sector, and knowledge institutions is also important in these interventions. So that's it. It's a long report, I know, but I hope you enjoy reading it. And if there is any questions, please, you can ask me now, or you can email me or Justin later, always.
Thank you so much, Evert-Jan. It's been a pleasure to read the report, and you presented us with a lot of food for thought with the findings of this literature review. And many of it, I'm sure, resonates with the challenges and the trade-offs that you mentioned that we face every day when trying to increase both the quality and the quantity of jobs for youth in Africa. Before we have already a few questions in the chat, but before we go into those, Theodore, we would love to hear your reflections.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Evjan. I think it was indeed a pleasure to read it and a confirmation on a lot of things that personally and my team has been seeing in different African countries. Well, for the rest, my name is Theodore Clovis. I work as a program manager for Orange Corners, an initiative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, of our embassies in different African and Middle Eastern countries. And I also am part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Youth Employment Team at the Special Ambassador for Youth Employment and Work. And actually what we tried to do 6 years ago is to convince local corporates to join us in an effort to create more jobs and to support young people in creating their own jobs. Because I firmly believe that government funding always has an end date. And therefore we said, well, they have a moral obligation to support the future generation of the country that they are active in. This report was, for me, a good confirmation in different points. First of all, I completely agree with the holistic approach that is recommended, that you cannot just do one intervention and one investment without taking into account that there are so many different elements that are playing a role in it. For instance, education. Outdated education is actually contributing to a higher unemployment rate because there are more accountants than carpenters. And therefore, we need to approach it in a holistic way. In the last 7 years, I've visited and I've researched 25 African countries, and I've visited in total 42. I just came back yesterday from holiday, but it was still in Africa. What I like and what I see a lot is that if I take the report, I'm not going to go into the details, but I've heard you saying, Evjan, a lot about the data. I think data is so key in everything that we do. When you read the different reports, you see that the methodology used to aggregate the data is not really clear, and there's no clear theory of change that really measures the impact of what we are doing so that we can reiterate our programs and therefore adjust them so that we can have a bigger impact at the end of the story. And I think by what you said, that comes with the fact that I understood from the different countries that I visited and I lived in that the lack of understanding of the context is really making things more complicated, because we are asked by our governments to do different programs on this topic, but we do not have enough time to invest in understanding the context and the real problems, and we solely depend on papers such as this. But I think going there on the ground, working with them from day-to-day basis, you really get a completely different understanding. And the other thing is that we need more long-term programs that are co-created with them, so that they feel included and they are part of the recommendations that they make. Now, what I also see is when you talk about the private sector development interventions, we have identified as well finance as one of the key obstacles. Finance and culture, societal norms are very important to boost decent jobs for youth. And that's why our program is partnering with existing hubs and also offering them small funds so that they can kickstart the business or grow their business. But we soon realized that awareness is also one of the biggest challenges. A lot of the youth do not know the plethora of the different programs that exist. And funny enough, a lot of them use social media. In majority of the country, social media is free of access because of special agreements between the telecom provider and Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. So a lot of donors could advertise their programs from there so that they could increase the outreach and so that young people understand better their potentials. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on all the examples, but I do resonate with almost everything that you said. For instance, access to finance is available most often for high potential firms that have gone through specific programs, but that leaves it, or that makes it very exclusive and only for well-connected individuals or firms that are often politically affiliated or have connections to. And I think that those programs should be available, those financial products should be available also for other people. And I know this is easily said than done, but for instance, microfinance institutions have alarming rates that are not accessible for any individual, because if you don't have collaterals, you are nobody that has access to nothing because of a lack of a financial track record that enables you or gives you some kind of credibility to get access to a fund product or a financial product, I mean. And together with funding, we need to also discuss more, and that's the evidence that we see, our empirical evidence that the regulatory framework for SaaS companies that are starting up or are scaling up is not there. Once they are formalized, which by no means should be forced, once they're formalized, they're hunted by the tax or revenue authorities. And this is an evidence that we have from almost all countries. Mozambique was the example that once they were registered, the tax authority was coming after them and saying like, oh, you got 2 employees. Are you paying insurances? Are you paying this taxes? New taxes, unclarity of what taxes they have to comply to. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I would round up just by saying that my major observations and our empirical evidence is that donor harmonization is something that we have a lot of work to do, with the exception of perhaps the Rwandan Development Board that requires every donor to pass by the board and explain what they're trying to do so that there are more harmonized approaches. I see that there's a competition between the different donors in making sure that the money is well spent on the X amount of time that is required. And we all know that November is always this month that we are checking up our balances and saying like, hey, have we spent all the budget or not? And how can we sprint so that we can spend more money so that we can report to our governments and to our parliaments? And that creates a lot of unfair competition, but also duplication of different programs. And I think we need to make sure that this is somehow avoided, and we need to be open and transparent about it and share our data, but also during those meetings that the different ambassadors have, share what they're planning to do and see where they can find synergies. My other point, I have 4 points, is that we need to invest also in local and non-physical infrastructures. When you look at the cost of internet, it's still very different. Countries such as Rwanda and Sudan have low cost, but countries such as Botswana or Zimbabwe have extremely high costs. And we should not forget that this is a generation that is more connected than ever before, and they're only going to increase that because smartphones that we have in Europe are not there, but they have their own cheaper versions of the smartphones. So e-commerce platforms are very, very popular, but we need those non-physical infrastructures or allow them to use them. And so that's one point. And then we also need to decentralize our actions. I think a lot is focused on the key urban areas, which I strongly believe that this is the biggest problem faced at the moment, urbanization. So this problem, yes, we should focus on the mega cities and on the big cities, on the capitals, but we should not forget the secondary cities. And the last point that it's actually triggering a lot of questions, but I think it's important to mention is from the different donors and the different multilateral organizations that I've met, I see that the teams often do not connect well with the teams that they're working with, the enterprise support organizations on the ground, let alone the teams that are changing all the time. I've been working with the AFDB, the ILO, and the World Bank and IFC And I see that teams change this all the time. And as Everjan said, every context is so specific that if you worked in Tunisia, that doesn't mean that you understand Nigeria. And if you work in Nigeria, that doesn't mean that you understand Tanzania or Mali or Burkina. So that context-conscious approach is very important, and international organizations should also invest in their teams and also require them to stay an X amount of time on certain projects so that we ensure continuity and we're increasing the capacity of the local teams and the teams that are working on those programs. I know there's a lot of information. I think rounding it up, the awareness of the possibilities for youth is very important, and the tailor-made interventions are also very important, because what happens in one country doesn't happen in the other country, and this is the evidence. And I know my information is going from A to B to K to L to back to C, but in principle, my empirical evidence for the last 7 years is confirmed by this report. But I do want to stress that we as donors should coordinate better with each other on what we are doing and how we could support each other.
Thank you very much, Theodore. I think this is an extremely important point. So thank you very much for bringing it to the attention. We have some questions from the audience, and I can see we have maybe 3 questions to the speakers and 1 question to other participants. And unfortunately, we have approximately 5, max 7 minutes of this webinar happening. So I want to just check whether someone maybe from our participants would like to address question of Marleen, where she's asking what is the experience of you regarding working on social norms related employment. Is there maybe someone who would like to come forward? Then please feel free to unmute your mic and step in, and also see how does it resonate with what Everjan and Theodore mentioned. Please don't be shy. Okay, well, in case that's fine. That's not a problem at all. Maybe in this case, I will then go back to Everjan and you, Theodore, with 3 remaining questions that we have from Karim, from ILO, again from Marleen, and from ADB. I'm gonna read them out loud together. So for the time, yes.
If I may interrupt, just on the question of Marleen, I can give a sort of example of what we've done in Sudan, where we have a society where obviously women have more obstacles to face and more challenges to face. So we designed a program called Empower Her, where we do specific sessions where we split the audience into male and female, young people, on average 100 people in it, and we bring a local female entrepreneur that they don't have to necessarily to look up to, but we ask her to share her story and what are the specific obstacles that she has been facing being a female entrepreneur. And then we ask the male participants in the audience to reflect on that and to understand whether they have been aware of that. And we've seen that this has created a completely different dynamic where our young male participants are now supporting more the female participants in such discussions and also in their own enterprises. So we've seen that the positive impact of confronting them with the challenges faced by female entrepreneurs.
Very good example. Yeah. Is there someone who also would like to share their experience?
This is Justin, the other author. Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. I mean, well, speaking in capacity of having worked on another report where we looked at the youth specificity of the employment problem in Africa. So to what extent are there specific characteristics to young people that that may apply less so to the general population? And we did look at socio-cultural norms. And actually, as Theodore just pointed out, the gender aspect was the larger aspect where there were, social cultural norms had an effect on youth employment, and specifically, again, we had done a kind of a review of literature, and we had found that in one very large review that school leavers, for example, female school leavers had a much narrower set of occupations than men, typically because they stuck to more traditional forms of employment: hairdressing, tailoring, catering, and typically it tended to take place near the home. And also, women often tried to avoid certain types of work because they viewed it as risky or even as inappropriate. So, for example, women in Sierra Leone chose to sell cold water rather than engage in foreign currency exchange, which could also have been more lucrative, because they felt that they were exposed to physical risk by carrying money. And also there were, we found that, or a review found that there was a lot of expectation among young women to offer sexual favors in exchange of getting a job, or even to get an interview, or at the interview stage to progress to the next stage of employment. So typically, they seem to, and we know this, but it's concrete, and there's some literature about it, that they limit themselves in terms of the employment, either because they view it as inappropriate or because they fear the risk of it, and that translates into a narrower amount of jobs that they engage in.
Yeah, thank you, Justin, for this intervention. And do you remember were there any concrete examples, or how can that be more those challenges can be translated more into practice or into programming?
I think probably also, as Theodore said, making men in communities more aware of these challenges, and probably working with them to see, well, what is acceptable, or why is something unacceptable, that may question, I guess, some beliefs, and also I think kind of promoting, if a young woman is ultimately helping to provide income, that might be more important than how she's doing that. I also just wanted to mention that in another part of that paper that we wrote, but there was also mentioned that, and also in our paper that we wrote with Ebert-Jan, that and this is true all around the world, but that there is, for example, in Liberia, but also in an African Development Bank report on the youth in the labor market, that employers in Africa, of course, as everywhere else, they look towards experience in hiring young people, and so young people who take longer to transition or who have never had a formal job before will be left out. And so, perhaps trying to maybe place less emphasis on that, or trying to find a way to either get to know young people or to match them in certain ways that help to bridge that experience gap, which is a real constraint to youth acceding to employment.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are running a little bit out of time. If I could just ask one more question. We have still a pending question from Karim and from ADB to you, Ebert-Jan, and to you, Theodore. If you could maybe briefly address it in 1 minute each. I'm going to read them. The question from Karim is, are there any example of specific private sector interventions in Africa that go beyond FDIs by foreign governments that include youth employment measures related to the quality of jobs? And the second question is, can you please expand on the practice of taking forward the recommendations on how to give more attention to shorter value chain development, perhaps with an emphasis on the role of the public sector? I need to ask you to be brief in your
Yes.
intervention.
Yeah, no, I think that they are both very, very relevant questions indeed. I think in the first one, on the quality of jobs, I think our report already says something about it. It's not only for indirect investments. For example, certification schemes and working on private standards are also very, very viable tools to increase job quality in specific sectors. I said productivity is important. So all interventions that look to productivity, that can be in any sector, and that doesn't have to be in foreign investors, but that seems to have the potential to increase productivity is related to creating quality of jobs, and at least in the longer term. And then all the more entrepreneurship, training, capacity building programs. We didn't go really into the details of those trainings, although of course I mentioned the impact on job creation, that it is not that much. But as the literature shows, maybe job creation is not that good for those trainings. But the entrepreneur itself can often increase their own income and quality of job. So in that sense, those kind of interventions I wanted to stress out can be used to increase quality of jobs. The other question, very briefly, from the ADB, it is about mainly about food value chain, so local value chains in rice or in fruits or vegetables, or milk, if it is more for the cold chain. So there are many different kinds of ways that you can really create. Look in those value chains and improve them. That can have job employment impact. For example, regional trade, inter-border relationship. There is a large amount of benefits if those if constraints between borders can improve. And we mentioned that in the paper with several examples and references to literature. So, and I saw that Marlene also had a question about the languages. I can be very short about that because we have in the paper one source about the World Bank who has an evaluation about their own experiences of linking smaller SMEs with lead firms. And so if you look at that reference, then you see lots of ways how they see what is working and what is not. But it is more or less the same kind of conclusion, if I say it right, as we have, that it is the link which should be coming from two ways. So if you only focus too much on the SMEs, improve them, then there will not automatically be a link with a lead firm. If you focus only on lead firms and improve their way how to connect with small medium enterprises, the whole selection way can be very troubling on who they choose and etc. and will benefit them from being included. So if you have both angles in a program, seems to be the best way, but the details are in that report.
Thank you very much, Everton. Theodore?
Yeah, well, somehow I lose the screen, but I can steer here. Oh, I'm back.
Yeah.
With regards to the quality of jobs, I mean, giving an exact example that has really benefited from it, I can not think of one immediately. What I want to say again is that there's no one size fits all, and there's no such thing as the golden recipe that this has worked in, let's say, Togo, and it will work in Benin or in Ethiopia. It really depends on the local context. But what I've seen about the capacity programs is that they're often not customized, and it requires a really long-term investment from all sides. For me, the most successful program in Africa is the Meltwater Enterprise Development Program in Ghana. That requires entrepreneurs to go to a program of 2 years, and the first year is just basic understanding of business acumen, and then after that they can create their own business, and then they get funding, and then they become successful firms. But that is a very long-term investment, but it has paid off, and I think one of the most successful startups of the African continent comes from those programs. So I do think that it really requires a combination of a connection to the local private sector that give access to the information and the networks that they possess to smaller firms so that they can work together, so synergies are made, and that brings us back to the local value chains development. In November, we visited Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger, where we did exactly that study to understand the value chains and which value chains will have more impact for youth. And our reports are actually publicly available. I'll make sure that I can share them with you. But what we saw there is when we talk about tomatoes and when we talk about milk or fonio, we cannot just, we really need to approach the whole value chain, meaning that from the very beginning of the farmers and the supply of the product to the production of the product to the transportation of the product to the processing of the product, and then of course to the whole retail and to the consumer. So it's the whole chain that needed to be developed, and the youth needed to understand what are the potentials in every part of that chain. And often they didn't know that there are so many potentials in every chain of that whole value chain, let's say milk. And then, of course, the other program comes in that milk powder was imported by France and was owned by a politically affiliated person, and no other milk was given any chance to enter the market. So it's a very, very complex problem every time that requires a local understanding.
Thank you so much, Theodore. These are really interesting examples, and I'm sure we can connect afterwards to discuss more about this. The paper contains also a lot of programs, and you brought up some very good examples through your reflections. So I invite everyone to please email us if you would like to continue the conversation on any specific country you're working on, and will be more happy to make those linkages to really work together and, like Theodore mentioned at the beginning, harmonize the work of the different organizations and the different donors. So thank you so much for also staying a bit longer than expected. We know that you have busy schedules, but this is an important conversation that we are continuing based on the findings of the synthesis report. And please feel free, like I said, to contact Agnieszka or myself if you have any further questions, and we will be happy to pass those to Theodore, Everett-Jan, or Justin. So thank you again, and look forward to speaking with all of you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Data collection, data collection, data collection.
Yes, thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.